Hello, my name's Alan March, and in this short video, I'm going to be talking about the urban planning controls that are used in Australia. I'll be using, in terms of wildfire, I'll be using the example of the Victorian planning system, mainly because it's the one I know the best. I'm in Victoria. And it's a good example of the basis of the way the states of Australia, most of the states of Australia, deal with wildfire risks through the urban planning system. I would say this is a very summarised version. There are other things going on and there's some complexities, but what I'll try and provide here is a clear overview by using some categories, which I'll show you in a moment. Many of the provisions that are in the Victorian planning system have origins back to the 90s, but were crystallised and clarified after the 2009 Black Saturday fires. The image you see here is of Marysville after the fire, and you can see the characteristics of that fire attack were largely through ember attack in the town, at least primarily. So as you will have noticed, if you looked at the other videos that I posted previously, you will see the essence of these controls that I'm describing are in mapping. Mapping is for the bushfire prone areas, which just invokes the building code. And then in high to extreme potential wildfire risk, it invokes the building code plus the urban planning regulations on top of that. Excuse me. So one of the starting points for this is the mapping through the planning system. Everywhere in Victoria is within a planning scheme, whether it's in the city or the country. Everywhere is zoned, and in places where there is a need for concern over high to extreme bushfire, wildfire risk, there is an overlay called the Bushfire Management Overlay. That essentially determines that a permit is required, and it's essentially the beginning of a process where the level of potential risk is assessed. So it doesn't predetermine what level of risk it is, except that it has the potential to be high or extreme. And this trigger for a permit means that assessment criteria are applied, and it's what you could essentially call a design response or performance standard approach to say, okay, in that location, with that vegetation, that topography, this is the kind of response that you need. So the first type of mechanism control that is included in those planning provisions is around separation. And essentially, when I say separation, I'm talking about separating or removing the structure in question, in this case, a house, from the hazard, the source of threat, in this case, a forest with a certain slope underneath it. And that dictates a distance that is needed to be set out in tandem with the nature of the building response that would occur at that distance. Within the planning scheme, in clause 5302, there are a set of tables that set out for different types of vegetation with different types of slope, what that distance should be. That's separation. So that's essentially the start of the first of 5 categories of control that the planning system places. And the reason this is quite powerful is that a permit can't be issued unless it complies with this standard for separation. The next one, and these all interact in a synergistic way, I will add. The next one is improving the resistance of the structure. So if you recall, there was a certain separation distance that was required from, in that case, the forest, and at that distance, a structural resistance level, what we call the bushfire attack level, is specified. And so you can see it's on a sliding scale, although there are categories within that. This is through the standard method, the simple method. And I guess you could say for a given fire, the closer you would get to the potential hazard, the vegetation, the higher the bushfire attack level would need to be to withstand the kind of fire attack you could predict on that structure. Obviously, this has cost implications, and it invokes progressively more onerous controls, essentially through the building system. So this is where the planning system brings in a building code at the same time. So these BAL levels are essentially to do with the structure, and the planning system requires that the building code be met for that separation distance and that structure. So that's improving the resistance of the structure to direct flame, to heat, to ember. And I suppose implied in that are other things to do with wind force, etc., that aren't really contained within the code. The other key mechanism that is intertwined with improving the resistance of the structure and the separation distance is to do with modifying or reducing the hazard itself. When we're talking about the planning system, we're essentially talking about what is contained on the land, which is getting a permit, whether it's for a larger subdivision or for an individual site. But essentially, if you imagine that there was that separation distance between the hazard and the structure was built at a certain bushfire attack level standard, the vegetation in that separation distance we call defendable space, and the permit requires that the vegetation or the land in general be maintained with respect to its vegetation in a specific way. Essentially, it must reduce the fire progress and its intensity in its progress. So a lot of the provisions in that defendable space standard for vegetation management are all about reducing the amount of fuel load, the continuity of the fuel load, and in particular, stopping vegetation being right up near the structure. And this, because it's in a planning permit, is enforceable. So action can be taken against people for not maintaining their property in accordance with that permit that talks, essentially it's about reducing the hazard on the land. The fourth category of mechanism is all about improving the response. This may be by the people who live on the land, but largely it's about improving the response of emergency services, largely the Country Fire Authority or Fire Response Victoria. So you can see this kind of things you probably expected already. Provision of water. So there are different provisions for water according to the size of the property. Access for emergency vehicles, turning circles, passing bays, fittings so that fire services know that they can hook on and extract water, whether it is to try and save this property or it may be another property elsewhere. And lastly, that there be a sign which indicates to fire services that yes, this property has been built in such a way that meets code and there is water down there. So this is located on the street boundary and quite a powerful mechanism for signalling to fire services that this structure, you know, they can get their trucks in and out and they've got enough visibility, they can hook onto water, etc. So this is about facilitating a wider response in some ways that goes beyond necessarily the structure on that land itself. Again, that's part of the permit that would be issued for that property. And finally, improving recovery. I would say this is the area that we, on one hand, do very well in that new structures will need to meet. So if, say, a structure is lost, is destroyed in a fire, When it's reconstructed, it will need to meet the new code. So that's very important. There are some provisions to allow temporary housing and whatnot. But I would say one thing we don't do particularly well, we don't really try to change the overall layout and organisation of communities that have been affected by fire in a systematic way. It's done in a bit of an ad hoc sort of fashion. That said, just having those provisions in place is a pretty powerful mechanism in the recovery process. So that's the 5 categories. I'll leave it at that. Obviously, there's lots of detail to go into, and we'll find ways of covering that in other videos. Thank you for your attention.